Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the corridors of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle into the comfort of your modern sanctuary as we explore a world that existed not so very long ago, yet feels impossibly distant from your warm bed and peaceful evening. The soft glow of electric lights, the gentle hum of central heating, the security of locked doors and stable borders. These simple luxuries would have seemed miraculous to those who lived through the tumultuous years we're about to explore together. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let your mind drift back to the early years of the 19th century, when Europe trembled beneath the footsteps of armies and the towering ambitions of one remarkable man. The continent had become a vast chessboard where emperors and generals moved entire nations like pieces, and where ordinary people found their lives swept up in forces far beyond their control. From the misty moors of Scotland to the sun-scorched plains of Spain, from the frozen wastes of Russia to the fertile valleys of Italy, the sound of war drums echoed across every border. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of a musket in your hands. 11 pounds of wood, metal, and powder that could mean the difference between life and death. Feel the rough wool of a military uniform against your skin, stiff with dirt and sweat, providing little protection against either the elements or enemy bayonets. Listen to the endless rhythm of marching feet on muddy roads, the creak of leather, the jangle of equipment, and the labored breathing of thousands of men who had left everything behind to follow the tricolor flag of France into the unknown. This was the reality for millions of young men across Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, a series of conflicts that stretched across more than 2 decades and would reshape not only the political boundaries of the continent, but the very soul of civilization. These wars gave birth to modern nationalism, transformed military strategy, and left scars on the landscape that archaeologists still uncover today. They were conflicts of unprecedented scale and brutality, where entire armies could vanish in a single campaign, and where the fate of nations hung on the decisions made by exhausted generals in muddy fields far from home. Tonight, we'll walk alongside a French conscript as he experiences the grinding realities of military life, feeling the ache in his feet from endless marches, tasting the thin soup that passes for sustenance, and wrestling with the terror that comes with facing death at 18 years old. We'll witness the final decisive moments at Waterloo that ended an empire and changed the course of history, standing in the rain and cannon smoke as the old guard makes its last desperate charge. We'll explore the archaeological mysteries left behind in mass graves across Europe, where the bones of forgotten soldiers tell stories that written records never could. And finally, we'll share a quiet, melancholy meal with the fallen emperor himself in his final days of exile, watching as the man who once commanded millions contemplates his legacy over a simple dinner on a remote Atlantic island. These stories remind us not only how precious our modern comforts truly are, but how thin the veneer of civilization can become when ambition and desperation collide on a continental scale. They show us a world where survival itself was victory enough, where a hot meal and a dry place to sleep represented unimaginable luxury, and where the difference between glory and disaster could be measured in a single afternoon. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones of a small French village as you step outside your family's modest home for what may be the last time. The year is 1807, and the Grande Armée's appetite for young men seems insatiable. At 18, your name has been drawn in the conscription lottery system that Napoleon refined to feed his war machine with a steady stream of soldiers. Your mother's tears still glisten on your cheek as you join the line of other young men, each carrying a small bundle of possessions that represents everything they own in the world. The conscription system, implemented through the Jourdan Law of 1798 and refined throughout Napoleon's reign, was both revolutionary and ruthlessly efficient. Every French male between the ages of 20 and 25 was eligible for military service, with annual levies determined by the needs of the army and the ambitions of the emperor. Local officials would gather the eligible men in the town square, and names would be drawn from a hat in a ceremony that could doom a young farmer 2 years of warfare or spare him to tend his fields. The wealthy could purchase substitutes, men desperate enough to take their place for a feedbot for the vast majority of French families. The lottery represented a terrible gamble with fate itself. You remember the weight of that moment when your name was called, how the sound seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings and reverberate through your chest. The mayor's voice, normally warm and familiar, had become cold and official as he read out the list of those selected. Some boys wept openly, others stood in stunned silence. A few attempted to flee, but the gendarmes were well practiced in dealing with reluctant conscripts. The penalties for desertion were severe. Napoleon's administrators had little patience for those who would shirk their duty to the empire. The journey to the regimental depot takes 3 days on foot, along roads clogged with other conscripts from dozens of surrounding villages. You sleep in barns when lucky, under hedgerows when not, and quickly learn that the civilian world and military world are separated by more than just a uniform. The sergeants who meet your group at the depot are weathered veterans with missing fingers, prominent scars, and eyes that have seen too much. They speak in clipped, harsh tones that brook no argument, and their first lesson is simple. Your previous life no longer exists. The depot itself is a sprawling complex of wooden barracks, training grounds, and administrative buildings, all surrounded by a wooden palisade that seems designed more to keep soldiers in than enemies out. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cooking fires, and the acrid smoke from the blacksmith's forge where weapons are repaired and maintained. Hundreds of young men mill about in various stages of transformation from civilian to a soldier, some still wearing their village clothes, others already sporting the blue coats and white breeches of the French infantry. Your first uniform is a revelation in discomfort. The wool jacket, dyed the distinctive blue of Napoleon's army, is rough against your skin and fits poorly, despite the quartermaster's assurances that it's the correct size. The white breeches are made of cheap linen that chafes with every step, and the black gaiters that extend from your ankle to just below your knee take nearly half an hour to button properly. The leather stock around your neck, meant to force you to keep your head high and maintain proper military posture, feels like a gentle form of strangulation. But it's the boots that truly introduce you to military, suffering hard leather. Contraptions that seem designed by someone who had never actually walked in them. The transformation from civilian to soldier begins immediately and proceeds with mechanical precision. Your hair, which you had worn long in the fashion of your village, is cropped short in the military style. Your personal possessions are inventoried and largely confiscated, placed with military chute equipment that you'll be financially responsible for if lost or damaged. You're assigned a number, a company, and a bunk in a barracks room that houses 40 men in a space that will be cramped for 20. Privacy becomes a forgotten luxury, and personal hygiene transforms from a private matter into a collective concern. The daily routine at the depot is designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it in military form. Reveille sounds before dawn, followed by roll call, inspection, and a breakfast that consists primarily of bread and thin soup. The morning hours are devoted to drill-less repetitions of marching, wheeling, forming lines, and presenting arms. The afternoon brings weapons training, where you learn to load and fire your musket with speed and precision. The Brown Bess musket, the standard infantry weapon of the era, is a smooth-bore flintlock that requires a complex sequence of movements to load and fire. each step practiced until it becomes automatic even under the stress of battle. Loading a musket properly requires you to bite open a paper cartridge containing gunpowder and a lead ball. Pour a small amount of powder into the priming pan. Close the frizzen. Pour the remaining powder down the barrel. Ram home the ball in paper wadding with a ramrod. Cock the hammer, aim, and fire. In ideal conditions, a well-trained soldier can manage 3 shots per minute, but battlefield conditions are rarely ideal. The weapon is accurate to perhaps 50 yards, though volley fire from massed formations can be effective at greater distances. The recoil is substantial, the noise deafening, and the smoke thick enough to obscure vision after just a few shots. Evening brings more drill, inspection of equipment, and the meager dinner that will have to sustain you through the night. The food at the depot is barely adequate for men engaged in hard physical training. Bread, soup, and occasionally a small portion of salted meat that has seen better days. Fresh vegetables are rare, and scurvy begins to appear among the recruits who spend more than a few weeks at the depot. The monotony of the diet is matched by its insufficiency, leaving you constantly hungry and dreaming of the hearty meals your mother used to prepare. Sleep comes fitfully in the overcrowded barracks, where 40 men share a space filled with the sounds and smells of poor sanitation and inadequate ventilation. Snoring, coughing, and the occasional cry from someone experiencing nightmares create a constant backdrop of noise. Illness spreads quickly in such close quarters, and dysentery, typhus, and other diseases exact their toll on the recruits before they ever see combat. The mortality rate at training depots was often shockingly high, with some units losing 10% of their strength to disease before completing their preparation for war. The psychological transformation proves as challenging as the physical one. You're no longer Jean-Baptiste, the farmer's son from a specific village with its own customs and dialect. You're now conscript number 847 of the 34th Regiment of Line Infantry. As part of a military machine that values uniformity above individuality, the sergeants work systematically to break down the regional identities and local loyalties that might interfere with military discipline. You're forbidden to speak in dialect, required to address all superiors with precise military courtesy, and punished swiftly for any behavior that smacks of civilian casualness. The punishments themselves are designed to reinforce the absolute nature of military authority. Minor infractions result in extra duty, reduced rations, or confinement to barracks. More serious violations can lead to flogging. Though Napoleon's army was somewhat less brutal in this regard than some of its contemporaries, the ultimate punishment, execution by firing squad, was reserved for desertion, cowardice in the face of the enemy, or mutiny. The mere threat of such consequences was usually sufficient to maintain discipline among men who had few alternatives and fewer resources to pursue them. As weeks pass at the depot, you begin to understand that the army has become your new family, with all the complicated loyalties and dependencies that family entails. Your messmates, the 6 to 8 men with whom you share cooking duties and rations, become your closest companions. You learn to trust them with your life, share your meager possessions, and depend on their support during the hardest moments. The bonds formed in these early days of military service often prove stronger than blood relationships, forged as they are in the shared crucible of hardship and mutual dependence. The weapons training gradually expands beyond basic musketry to include bayonet drill, a terrifying dance of thrust and parry that prepares you for the most intimate form of combat, the bayonet. A 17-inch blade that attaches to the end of your musket transforms your firearm into a spear and your role from shooter to shock trooper. Bayonet combat is brutal and personal, requiring not just physical skill, but psychological preparation for the moment when you must look into another man's eyes and fight for your life with sharp steel. The training is deliberately harsh, designed to overcome the natural human reluctance to engage in close combat with lethal weapons. After 6 weeks at the depot, Orders arrived that transformed the routine of training into the urgent reality of deployment. The 34th Regiment of Line Infantry is to join Marshal Davout's the 3rd Corps for the campaign in Poland, part of Napoleon's grand strategy to crush the Russian Empire once and for all. The excitement that ripples through the barracks is tinged with an undercurrent of fear, as even the newest recruits understand that their months of preparation are about to be tested in the crucible of Quatsai. In the crucible of the departure from the depot occurs before dawn on a cold October morning, with the regiment formed up in column of march along the muddy road that leads east toward the German states. Each soldier carries approximately 60 pounds of equipment, his musket and bayonet, 60 rounds of ammunition in a leather cartridge box, a knapsack containing spare clothing and personal items, a haversack for rations, a water bottle, a blanket roll, and various other pieces of military gear. The weight settles across your shoulders and back like a familiar burden. Though familiar doesn't mean comfortable, and the straps dig into your flesh within the first hour of marching. The column stretches to more than a mile when fully extended, with the regimental eagle at its head, carried by a sergeant whose weathered hands have borne the standard through a dozen battles. The eagle itself is a bronze sculpture of Napoleon's symbol perched atop a wooden pole, surrounded by streamers that list the regiment's battle honors: Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, Wagram. These names represent more than geographical locations. They're sacred words that connect you to the glory and sacrifice of those who marched under this same eagle before you. The sight of the standard, catching the weak morning sunlight as it advances through the mist, stirs something in your chest that you hadn't expected, a swelling of pride that surprises you with its intensity. The rhythm of the march quickly establishes itself as the dominant fact of your existence. Left, right, in cadence with the muffled drums that set the pace for the entire column. Your feet, still tender despite weeks of training, begin to ache within the first few miles, and by midday, the pain has become a constant companion that will follow you across half of Europe. The poorly fitted boots rub against your heels and toes, creating blisters that burst and reform in an endless cycle of minor agony. Some men stuff their boots with straw or cloth to improve the fit, but this often makes the problem worse by creating additional friction points and reducing circulation. The roads of early 19th century Europe were primitive by modern standards, little more than dirt tracks that turned to muddy quagmires at the first sign of rain. The passage of a single regiment could reduce a passable road to a churned morass that would challenge the next unit to follow. When multiple corps moved along the same route, as frequently happened during major campaigns, the roads became virtually impassable, forcing units to spread out across the countryside and forage for supplies that local communities could rarely spare. The environmental impact of moving large armies was catastrophic, leaving behind a trail of destroyed crops, contaminated water sources, and devastated communities that might take years to recover. Your daily ration, when available, consists of 1.5 pounds of bread, a quarter pound of meat, and small amounts of beans, rice, or vegetables. In practice, these official rations were rarely met, particularly during active campaigns when supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across hostile territory. The bread was often days old and sometimes moldy. The meat was frequently salted, pork that had been preserved for months or years, and the vegetables were whatever could be procured locally through requisition or foraging. Hunger becomes a constant companion, gnawing at your stomach and occupying your thoughts in quiet moments. The process of foraging, a euphemism for organized scavenging that often bordered on theft, became essential for survival during long marches. Soldiers would spread out from the main column to search farms, villages, and isolated homesteads for anything edible. Chickens, pigs, vegetables, grain, and dairy products all disappeared into military haversacks, often leaving civilian with populations on the brink of starvation. The local authorities might lodge formal complaints with the army commanders, but these were rarely addressed with any urgency when weighed against the needs of keeping soldiers fed and functional. Water presented an even more critical challenge than food. Clean drinking water was scarce along most march routes, and armies had no choice but to use whatever sources they encountered. Wells might be contaminated by previous military units. Rivers could be polluted by upstream activities, and stagnant ponds harbor diseases that could devastate entire companies. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever spread rapidly through the ranks, killing more soldiers than enemy action in many campaigns. The smart veterans learned to look for clear running water and to boil it when possible. But fuel for fires was often scarce, and time for proper preparation was a luxury that field commanders rarely allowed. The weather during your march east proves particularly brutal, with early winter storms turning the roads into rivers of mud and ice. Your wool uniform, designed for parade grounds rather than extended field service, provides inadequate protection against the driving rain and bitter wind. The wool shrinks and becomes stiff when wet, chafing against your skin and restricting movement. Your feet remain perpetually damp inside boots that were never truly waterproof, creating perfect conditions for frostbite and trench foot. Some mornings, you wake to find your blanket frozen to the ground, and breaking camp requires chipping away ice that has formed around your equipment during the night. Sleep becomes a precious commodity that you learn to appreciate in small doses and uncomfortable positions. The army rarely halts early enough to allow for proper rest, and reveille comes long before dawn, regardless of when you finally manage to close your eyes. You sleep in barns when they're available, in abandoned buildings when you can find them, and in the open air more often than not. Sharing body heat with your messmates becomes a matter of survival rather than comfort, and personal modesty quickly gives way to practical necessity. The ground is hard, the air is cold, and every joint aches when you wake to the sound of drums. It's calling you back to the march. Medical care during the march ranges from primitive to non-existent. The regimental surgeon, when present, focuses primarily on treating serious injuries that might return men to duty. Minor ailments, chronic conditions, and most diseases are left to resolve themselves or claim their victims. Soldiers develop their own folk remedies and share whatever knowledge they possess about treating common problems like infected wounds, stomach ailments, and respiratory complaints. Many carry small supplies of herbs, patent medicines, or homemade remedies that may or may not provide actual relief, but offer psychological comfort in desperate situations. The relationships between officers and enlisted men become more complex and nuanced during the hardships of extended marching. The best officers shared the privations of their men, eating the same food, sleeping in the same conditions, and demonstrating through personal example that rank brings responsibility as well as privilege. These leaders inspire fierce loyalty and will find their men following them into seemingly hopeless situations with unwavering determination. Poor officers who demand special privileges while their men suffer quickly lose the respect of their subordinates and may find themselves abandoned or even fragged during the confusion of battle. Discipline during the march must be maintained without the formal structure of barracks life, relying instead on the internal cohesion of the unit and the personal leadership of junior officers and non-commissioned officers. Stragglers present a constant problem as men fall behind due to illness, exhaustion, or simple lack of motivation. Some catch up with the column during rest halts. Others are collected by the rear guard, and many simply disappear into the countryside, becoming deserters by default rather than design. The provost marshal and his men patrol the column looking for signs of indiscipline, but their resources are limited and their attention focused on more serious offenses than simple fatigue. Entertainment during rest periods becomes crucial for maintaining morale during long marches. Soldiers sing traditional songs, tell stories from their home regions, play simple games with dice or cards, and engage in the timeless military tradition of complaining about everything from the food to the officers to the weather. Music plays a particularly important role, with regimental bands providing both official ceremonies and informal entertainment. The sound of familiar melodies can transform the mood of an entire company, reminding men of home while simultaneously reinforcing their identity as soldiers of the empire. Letters from home arrive irregularly and represent precious connections to a world that seems increasingly distant with each mile traveled. The ability to read and write, still uncommon among the rural population from which most soldiers were drawn, makes literate men valuable to their illiterate comrades who depend on them to read incoming letters and compose responses. These sessions around campfires or in temporary shelters often become communal affairs where news from one family is shared with the entire group, creating extended networks of vicarious connection to civilian life. The approach to the combat zone brings subtle changes in atmosphere and routine that experienced soldiers recognize immediately. The countryside shows increasing signs of previous military activity: burned buildings, abandoned farms, hastily constructed fortifications, and the occasional grave marker indicating where skirmishes or battles have taken place. Civilian populations become scarcer and more suspicious, having learned through bitter experience that armies bring destruction regardless of their declared intentions. The very landscape seems to hold its breath in anticipation of the violence to come. Your first encounter with actual combat occurs not in a grand battle, but in a small skirmish near a bridge over a swollen river. A company of Austrian light infantry has taken position among the ruins of a burned mill, and your battalion is ordered to dislodge them. The reality of combat proves both more chaotic and more terrifying than your training had suggested. Sound of musket balls whistling overhead is unlike anything you've experienced, and the acrid smoke that fills the air burns your eyes and throat. Men fall around you with cries that will haunt your dreams, and the neat formations practiced on the parade ground dissolve into desperate groups of frightened soldiers trying to survive their first taste of warfare. The aftermath of even a minor engagement reveals truths about military life that no amount of training could convey. The wounded cry for help in voices that carry across the battlefield like prayers to an indifferent God. The dead lie in positions that speak eloquently of their final moments, and you learn that death in battle is rarely dignified or peaceful. The work of collecting casualties, tending to the wounded, and burying the dead falls to the survivors, and you discover that war requires as much labor as violence. Your hands shake as you help carry a wounded comrade to the surgeon's station, and you realize that the boy from your village who left home 6 months ago no longer exists. The weeks that follow your first skirmish blurred together in a haze of marching, fighting, and struggling to survive in conditions that test the limits of human endurance. The Polish campaign proves to be everything that veterans warned you about, and worse, a grinding ordeal that strips away illusions about military glory and reveals warfare as a brutal contest between competing forms of organized suffering. Your regiment becomes part of Marshal Davout's inexorable advance toward Warsaw, moving through a landscape that bears the scars of centuries of conflict and shows little mercy to invading armies, regardless of their nationality or cause. The countryside through which you march tells its own story of military devastation. Villages stand empty, their inhabitants fled or dead, with only burned timbers and broken walls marking where homes once stood. Fields that should have been harvested months ago lie fallow and frost-covered. The crops rotted in place or consumed by earlier military units. Wells have been poisoned or filled with debris, roads destroyed, bridges burned, and every possible resource either removed or rendered useless to advancing armies. The scorched earth policy employed by retreating forces creates a hellish landscape where survival requires constant struggle against hunger, exposure, and disease. Your uniform, once a source of pride, despite its discomfort, now resembles little more than organized rags held together by determination and military discipline. The blue wool has faded to a nondescript gray-brown color, stained with mud, blood, and substances you prefer not to identify. Holes appear faster than they can be patched, and the constant friction of marching has worn through the fabric at stress points like knees, elbows, and shoulders. Your boots have disintegrated to the point where they're held together primarily by strips of cloth wrapped around your feet, providing minimal protection against the frozen ground and sharp debris that litter every path. The cold becomes an enemy, more relentless than any human opponent, seeping into your bones and sapping your strength with every breath of frigid air. Polish winters are legendary for their severity, and the winter of 1807 proves particularly brutal, even by local standards. Temperatures plunge far below freezing and remain there for weeks at a time, while howling winds drive snow and ice through every gap in your inadequate clothing. Frostbite clings fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs, creating casualties as surely as enemy musket fire. Men wake in the morning to find their companions frozen solid beside them, victims of a war that kills through exposure as efficiently as through violence. Food becomes an obsession that occupies every waking thought and influences every decision. The official ration system has collapsed completely under the strain of extended supply lines in hostile territory. Foraging parties range farther and farther from the main column, often engaging in running battles with local partisans who defend their remaining resources with desperate courage. You learn to eat things that would have disgusted you months earlier. Bark stripped from trees and boiled into a bitter soup, roots dug from frozen ground and chewed raw, leather from abandoned equipment, softened in hot water until it becomes barely digestible. Hunger gnaws at your stomach constantly, a physical pain that makes concentration difficult and decision-making nearly impossible. Water presents challenges that become increasingly desperate as winter tightens its grip on the landscape. Natural sources freeze solid for weeks at a time, forcing soldiers to melt snow and ice in whatever containers they can improvise from damaged equipment. The process requires fuel that's almost impossible to find in the devastated countryside, and the melted water often carries contamination from the polluted snow and ice collected around military encampments. Dehydration becomes a serious problem, even in the midst of winter, as the body's need for liquid increases with the effort required to stay warm. Men learn to carry containers close to their bodies to prevent freezing, but this practice often results in contaminated water that causes illness rather than relief. The medical situation deteriorates to the point where the regimental surgeon can do little more than separate the dying from those who might survive with minimal treatment. Typhus spreads through the ranks like wildfire, spread by lice that thrive in the unwashed uniforms and cramped shelters where soldiers seek refuge from the cold. Dysentery remains a constant companion, weakening men until they can no longer keep up with the march and must be left behind to whatever fate awaits stragglers in hostile territory. Respiratory infections claim victims daily, as men already weakened by hunger and exposure succumb to ailments that healthy individuals could easily survive. The psychological toll of the campaign begins to show in ways both subtle and dramatic. Men who seemed steady and reliable during training crack under the sustained pressure of combat, exposure, and starvation. Some simply sit down during the march and refuse to continue, staring into the distance with empty eyes that see nothing of the present moment. Others become irrationally violent, lashing out at their comrades over minor disputes or imagined slights. Sleep brings nightmares that cause men to cry out in the darkness, reliving battles or dreaming of home with an intensity that leaves them more exhausted upon waking than they were before they close their eyes. The bonds between soldiers intensify under these extreme conditions, creating relationships that transcend ordinary friendship and approach something closer to brotherhood or marriage. You learn to depend absolutely on your messmates for survival, sharing your last piece of bread without question and trusting them to do the same for you. These men become your family in the most literal sense, bound together by shared suffering and mutual dependence in ways that peacetime relationships rarely achieve. When one of your group falls ill or is wounded, the others will carry his equipment, share their meager rations, and provide whatever comfort they can manage in circumstances that offer little hope and less mercy. Communication with the outside world becomes increasingly sporadic and unreliable. Letters from home arrive months late, if they arrive at all, carrying news that feels like reports from another planet, where people worry about harvest festivals and village gossip rather than survival and military objectives. Your own letters home, when you have the opportunity and materials to write them, seem inadequate to convey the reality of your situation. How can you explain to your mother that her son still exists, but that the boy she raised has been replaced by a creature focused entirely on the basic necessities of staying alive? How can you describe the smell of frozen corpses or the sound that musket balls make when they strike human flesh? The officers who survived the campaign's early stages proved their worth through their ability to maintain unit cohesion and military effectiveness under impossible conditions. The best leaders share every hardship with their men while somehow maintaining the authority and decision-making capability that keeps their units functioning as military organizations rather than armed mobs. They make the hard choices about when to halt for rest and when to press forward despite exhaustion, when to fight for questionable objectives, and when to conserve their strength for more important battles. These men earn a respect and loyalty from their soldiers that peacetime service could never achieve, becoming figures of almost mythical status within their units. Discipline evolves from the formal structure of barracks life into something more organic and essential to survival. Men follow orders not because regulations require it, but because they understand that military organization represents their only hope of surviving circumstances that would quickly kill isolated individuals. The traditional punishments of flogging and confinement become irrelevant when every man is already suffering beyond the capacity of artificial penalties to increase. Instead, discipline becomes a matter of collective responsibility, where the group police their own behavior out of recognition that everyone's survival depends on maintaining unit cohesion and effectiveness. Battle, when it comes, provides almost a relief from the grinding misery of the march. Combat focuses the mind wonderfully, eliminating all concerns except the immediate questions of loading, firing, advancing, and staying alive from one moment to the next. The chaos and terror of fighting seem almost manageable compared to the slow torture of starvation and exposure that characterizes campaign life. In battle, you can fight back against the forces trying to kill you. During the march, you can only endure and hope that your endurance proves sufficient to carry you through another day. Your first major engagement occurs during the assault on a fortified town whose name you never learn and whose strategic importance remains unclear to soldiers focused on more immediate concerns. The attack begins before dawn with an artillery bombardment that turns the pre-dawn darkness into a hellish landscape of fire and smoke. The sound of cannons firing and shells exploding creates a constant thunder that drowns out shouted commands and makes communication nearly impossible. When the order comes to advance, you find yourself moving forward through the smoke and confusion. Not from courage, but from the momentum of the men around you, and the knowledge that stopping in the open ground would mean certain death. The fighting in the town's narrow streets proves more vicious and personal than anything your training had prepared you for. Every doorway might conceal an enemy soldier, every window could hide a sniper, and every corner presents a potential ambush. You learn to move from cover to cover, using door frames and building corners to shield yourself from enemy fire, while looking for opportunities to advance closer to your objectives. The musket in your hands becomes an extension of your will to survive, and you fire it at shadows, movement, and anything that might represent a threat to your continued existence. The aftermath of urban combat reveals the true cost of military success. The town lies in ruins, with entire blocks reduced to rubble by artillery fire and the desperate fighting that followed. Civilian casualties are scattered throughout the streets, victims of violence that makes no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Your own unit has suffered heavily, with nearly half the men you started with either dead, wounded, or missing. The victory, if it can be called that, feels hollow and pointless when measured against the price paid to achieve it. You sit among the ruins and wonder whether the strategic objectives that brought you to this place could possibly justify the human cost of attaining them. The news reaches you in early March of 1815, spreading through the garrison at Lille like wildfire through dry kindling. Napoleon has returned from Elba, the emperor who abdicated barely a year ago, who was exiled to that tiny Mediterranean island while Europe celebrated peace, has landed in France with barely 1,000 men and is marching north toward Paris. The reaction among the soldiers is electric, a mixture of disbelief, excitement, and apprehension that crackles through every conversation and colors every interaction. With your officers, you are no longer the frightened conscript who stumbled through his first campaign in Poland 8 years ago. The intervening years have transformed you from boy to veteran, from provincial farmer's son to grizzled soldier of the empire. Your face bears the weathered lines that mark men who have seen too much, and your eyes hold the 1,000-yard stare, common to those who have survived battles where thousands fell. The uniform you wear now fits properly, broken in by years of service, patched and repatched until it resembles a patchwork quilt of military blue. Your musket is as familiar in your hands as a craftsman's tools, and you can load and fire it with a mechanical precision that comes only from performing the same actions under fire countless times. The years since Poland have brought both triumph and disaster in roughly equal measure. You marched with the Grande Armée into Russia in 1812, part of the largest military force ever assembled in European history. More than 600,000 men drawn from across Napoleon's empire and allied states. You witnessed the burning of Moscow and endured the nightmare retreat that followed, watching as one of the greatest armies in history dissolved into a frozen mob of starving survivors. Of the men who crossed the Niemen River in June, fewer than 20,000 effective soldiers made it back to friendly territory, and you were among the fortunate few who lived to tell the tale. The memory of that retreat still haunts your dreams. The endless columns of stumbling men, the bodies that littered every mile of the road back toward Poland, the way horses and men simply fell and never rose again. You remember the taste of leather soup and the feeling of your own body consuming itself for energy as starvation took its inexorable toll. You learned that armies could die not from enemy action, but from the simple mathematics of distance, weather, and logistics. The greatest military mind of the age had led his forces so far from their supply bases that victory became impossible and survival doubtful. After Russia came the campaigns in Germany, a desperate series of battles as Napoleon tried to rebuild his shattered forces while a coalition of enemies closed in from all sides. You fought at Leipzig in 1813, the Battle of Nations that sealed the emperor's fate and drove the French armies back across the Rhine for the first time in 20 years. The coalition forces Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Swedes outnumbered Napoleon's hastily assembled army by more than 2 to 1. And the fighting raged for 3 days across a landscape that would be remembered as the bloodiest battlefield in European history until the 20th century brought its own industrial-scale slaughter. The final campaign of 1814 had been perhaps the most brilliant of Napoleon's career. A series of lightning strikes against superior forces that demonstrated his tactical genius, even as strategic defeat became inevitable. You marched and fought through the countryside of eastern France, watching as the emperor tried to work miracles with an army composed largely of teenage conscripts and middle-aged veterans. The young soldiers, barely trained and equipped with whatever weapons could be hastily manufactured, showed remarkable courage in hopeless situations, while the veterans provided the steady backbone that held units together when logic suggested they should dissolve. The abdication, when it came, felt almost anticlimactic after months of increasingly desperate fighting. Napoleon's marshals and political leaders had finally convinced him that continued resistance would only bring more suffering to France without changing the ultimate outcome. You were among the thousands of soldiers who watched as their emperor signed away his throne and accepted exile to Elba, a tiny island off the Italian coast that seemed an appropriately small stage for the conclusion of such a vast drama. The year that followed proved surprisingly difficult for veterans of the Grande Army. The Bourbon Restoration under Louis XVIII brought its peace, but also a subtle hostility toward those who had served the usurper too faithfully. Your pension was small and irregularly paid, your prospects for advancement non-existent, and the civilian world seemed to regard veteran soldiers with a mixture of suspicion and pity that was harder to bear than outright hostility. France needed to forget its military adventures and focus on rebuilding, but this left little place for men whose primary skills involved organized violence on an industrial scale. The news of Napoleon's return changes everything in the space of a few hours. Orders arrive from Paris commanding all military units to arrest the escaped prisoner and his followers. But these orders compete with older loyalties and more complex emotions. The soldiers around you begin to whisper about the glorious days when French armies were feared throughout Europe, when the tricolor flag represented not just another nation, but a revolutionary force that promised to reshape the world. The current regime offers stability and legitimacy, but it lacks the electric charisma that once made men willing to die for their emperor's dreams. The regiment's colonel, a royalist appointee who replaced the previous commander after the Restoration, calls an assembly to read the official proclamation ordering Napoleon's arrest. His voice carries the proper tone of authority, but you can see the uncertainty in his eyes as he looks out over ranks of soldiers whose faces reveal nothing of their inner thoughts. These men served under the eagle for years, bled for the empire, and watched their comrades die for causes they believed were greater than themselves. Now they're being asked to treat their former emperor as a common criminal. And the silence that greets the colonel's words speaks more eloquently than any response. The first defections begin within hours of the official announcement. Junior officers slip away in the night, taking their equipment and whatever men they can convince to follow them. Entire companies begin to melt away as soldiers make individual decisions about where their ultimate loyalty lies. The process accelerates when news arrives that regular army units are joining Napoleon rather than opposing him, that marshal after marshal is declaring for the emperor, and that King Louis XVIII has fled Paris rather than face the returning eagles. Your own decision, when it comes, feels less like a choice than an inevitable recognition of what you've always known. You've never been a royalist. You've never felt any particular attachment to the Bourbon dynasty that represents the old order Napoleon swept away. Your loyalty has always been to France, but more specifically to the France that conquered Europe and made ordinary men feel part of something extraordinary. It's the prospect of serving under commanders who were placed in their positions by foreign powers rather than earned through merit and sacrifice feels fundamentally wrong in ways that transcend political theory or constitutional law. The march south toward Paris becomes a triumphal procession that grows larger with every mile. Entire regiments join the growing column, bringing their arms, equipment, and renewed enthusiasm for the cause they thought had died on the battlefields of Germany. Veterans of Austerlitz and Wagram march alongside young soldiers who have heard the legends but never experienced the reality of serving under Napoleon's direct command. The enthusiasm is infectious, sweeping away the depression and resignation that characterized the previous year and replacing it with the intoxicating possibility that the great adventure might not be over after all. Napoleon himself appears among the troops with a frequency and informality that would have been unthinkable under the Bourbons. He rides along the column of march, stopping to speak with groups of soldiers, remembering names and faces from previous campaigns, asking about families, and showing the personal touch that made him beloved by men who had followed him across half the world. His physical appearance shows the toll of recent years. He's gained weight during his exile. His hair has thinned, and his movements lack some of their former energy. But his presence still generates the kind of electric excitement that transforms ordinary soldiers into devoted followers. The entry into Paris on March 20th feels like a vindication of everything you believed about the rightness of your cause. Crowds line the streets, cheering for the returning emperor. Veterans weep openly as they see the imperial standard raised once again over the Tuileries Palace, and the city seems to pulse with renewed energy and purpose. The 100 days, though. Nobody uses that term, yet have begun, and France has chosen its future through the simple expedient of welcoming back the man who made it great. But even in the midst of celebration, experienced soldiers like yourself can sense the underlying problems that no amount of enthusiasm can solve. The European powers that defeated Napoleon in 1814 are already mobilizing their forces for another war, and their combined resources dwarf anything France can hope to field. The British Navy controls the seas, cutting off potential allies and sources of supply. The Spanish ulcer continues to drain French resources and manpower with no end in sight. Most critically, the French people are warrioring after more than 20 years of almost continuous conflict, and their support for renewed military adventures is far from certain. The military situation proves even more challenging than the political. 1. The army that Napoleon inherits in 1815 is a shadow of the Grande Armée that conquered Europe. Many of the most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers died in Russia or Germany, and their replacements lacked the combat experience and institutional knowledge that made the Imperial Army so effective. The enlisted ranks include too many green recruits and too few of the grizzled veterans who provided the steady backbone of previous campaigns. Equipment shortages are chronic, with many units lacking adequate muskets, uniforms, and basic supplies that any effective military force requires. The international situation makes Napoleon's strategic position almost hopeless from the beginning. The Treaty of Chaumont, signed by the Allied powers in 1814, commits Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia to maintain their coalition until Napoleon is definitively defeated. These four powers can field more than 1 million men between them, backed by financial resources that dwarf France's capacity to compete. Additional German states, motivated by both fear and opportunity, are likely to join the coalition, further tilting the balance against French interests. Time becomes the most precious resource as Napoleon attempts to rebuild his military capabilities before the Allied armies can complete their mobilization. Every day of delay allows enemy forces to grow stronger while French resources remain essentially static. The emperor's strategic genius is undimmed, but genius requires adequate tools to accomplish its objectives, and those tools are in desperately short supply. It's the mathematics of military power, never favorable to France's position, has become even more challenging during the year of exile and political uncertainty. Intelligence reports arriving in Paris paint an increasingly grim picture of enemy preparations. The Duke of Wellington has been appointed to command a mixed army of British Dutch, Belgian, and German troops concentrating in Belgium, while Marshal Blucher leads a Prussian force that includes many veterans of the previous year's campaigns. These two armies, totaling more than 200,000 men, represent only the advance guard of the massive forces assembling against France. Additional Austrian and Russian armies are marching across Germany, and their arrival will make Napoleon's position untenable, regardless of any tactical victories he might achieve against the initial Allied forces. The recruitment of new soldiers proceeds with mixed results, hampered by war weariness among the civilian population and practical difficulties in equipping and training large numbers of men in a short time. Many of the veterans who served in previous campaigns are dead, disabled, or simply too old for active service, while the younger generation lacks both experience and enthusiasm for military adventures that seem likely to end badly. The National Guard provides additional manpower, but with questionable reliability and effectiveness compared to regular Army units with proper training and equipment. Strategic planning must balance optimism with realism, hope with mathematical calculation. Napoleon's best chance lies in striking quickly against the Allied armies before they can coordinate their operations effectively, defeating them in detail before their superior numbers can be brought to bear decisively. This strategy requires perfect timing, flawless intelligence, and a degree of tactical execution that leaves no room for the kind of errors that plague even the best military operations. The margin for error is essentially zero, and the consequences of failure are too obvious to require detailed analysis. The orders come down on June 12, 1815, with the crisp authority that you remember from the great campaigns of the past. The Army of the North will cross into Belgium and strike the Allied forces before they can unite their scattered corps into a single, overwhelming mass. It's a plan that reflects Napoleon's strategic genius at its finest, audacious, clumsily calculated, dependent on the kind of rapid movement and coordination that made the Grande Armée legendary throughout Europe. As you prepare your equipment and check your ammunition for what might be the final campaign of your military career, you feel the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that precedes every major operation. The army that assembles for the Belgian campaign is both impressive and troubling to the veteran eye. On paper, Napoleon commands roughly 125,000 men organized into 7 corps, plus the Imperial Guard, Cavalry Reserve, and Artillery Parka, substantial force by any measure, and one that includes many veterans of previous campaigns. The equipment is generally adequate, with most units properly armed and uniformed, though shortages of ammunition and supplies hint at the logistical challenges that will plague the entire operation. The organization appears solid, with experienced commanders at most levels and staff work that reflects the institutional knowledge accumulated over 2 decades of almost continuous warfare. Yet closer inspection reveals troubling weaknesses that no amount of enthusiasm can entirely mask. Too many of the junior officers are recent appointments who lack the combat experience that separates competent leaders from truly effective ones. The enlisted ranks include large numbers of young conscripts, whose training has been abbreviated by time constraints and resource limitations. Perhaps most critically, the entire force has been assembled hastily, with units drawn from different regions and combined into formations that lack the mutual trust and understanding that characterizes veteran military organizations. Your own regiment, the 34th Line Infantry, reflects both the strengths and weaknesses of the Army as a whole. The Corps consists of veterans like yourself, men who have marched across Europe and fought in every major engagement of the past decade. These soldiers know their trade intimately, can load and fire their muskets with mechanical precision under the worst conditions, and understand instinctively how to work together as an effective military unit. They form the steady backbone that holds the regiment together during crisis and provides the leadership that transforms civilian conscripts into functional soldiers. But nearly half the regiment consists of men who have never fired their weapons, in anger, who learned their drill on parade grounds rather than battlefields, and who have yet to discover how their bodies and minds will react to the chaos and terror of actual combat. These recruits show proper enthusiasm and follow orders with commendable precision. But enthusiasm and precision are poor substitutes for experience when circumstances require split-second decisions that mean the difference between life and death. The integration of veterans and recruits within the same units provides some mitigation, but it also creates internal tensions and reduces overall effectiveness compared to formations composed entirely of experienced soldiers. The march north begins before dawn on June 15th, with the army moving in multiple columns toward the Belgian frontier. The roads are familiar to many veterans who traveled them during the campaigns of previous years. But now they lead toward an uncertain destiny rather than assured triumph. The countryside shows signs of renewed prosperity after the devastation of earlier wars, with farms rebuilt, crops growing, civilian traffic moving freely along routes that once carried only military supplies and wounded soldiers. The crossing of the frontier occurs with minimal opposition, as Allied intelligence has failed to detect the concentration and movement of French forces until too late to prevent the invasion. The small Prussian outposts retreat quickly rather than attempt to delay such superior numbers. And by mid-morning, French troops are advancing along multiple roads into the heart of Belgium. The initial success generates optimism throughout the ranks, with soldiers joking that perhaps this campaign will prove easier than the pessimists predicted. The town of Charleroi falls by afternoon, its garrison overwhelmed by numbers that permit no effective resistance. The capture of this strategic crossroads opens multiple routes toward Brussels and provides Napoleon with the operational flexibility that his strategy requires. More importantly, it demonstrates that French forces retain their capacity for rapid movement and decisive action despite the organizational challenges of the past few months. The soldiers who occupy Charleroi march with straighter backs and more confident steps, reassured by this early evidence that their training and preparation have been adequate for the task at hand. But intelligence reports, arriving at headquarters, paint a more complex picture of Allied dispositions than initial reconnaissance had suggested. Wellington's Angloed army is scattered across a wide area west of Brussels, concentrated neither for defense nor for immediate offensive action. Blucher's Prussians are similarly dispersed, with their corps spread across the countryside between Namur and Liege. This dispersion offers opportunities for defeating the enemy forces in detail, but it also creates risks if French movements lack the coordination and speed necessary to prevent Allied concentration. The bifurcation of the army into separate columns, pursuing different objectives, reflects both Napoleon's strategic brilliance and the practical constraints under which he must operate. Marshal Ney receives command of the left wing with orders to advance toward Catabras, where intelligence reports suggest Wellington might attempt to concentrate his forces. Marshal Grouchy leads the right wing toward Flores to engage whatever Prussian forces can be located and brought to battle. Napoleon himself retains direct command of the Central Reserve, positioning himself to support whichever wing encounters serious opposition first. Your regiment marches with the left wing under Ney, advancing along roads that grow progressively more congested as multiple columns converge on the same routes. The traffic management proves challenging despite the staff's best efforts, with artillery trains, supply wagons, cavalry units, and infantry formations competing for limited road space. The resulting delays and confusion highlight the difficulties of coordinating large-scale military movements, even when opposition is minimal in terrain. Conditions are favorable. The soldiers around you maintain generally good spirits during the march, sustained by adequate rations, reasonable weather, and the apparent success of the initial phases of the campaign. Veterans share stories of previous campaigns, while newer soldiers listen with the wide-eyed attention that comes from finally participating in events they've only heard described. The songs and jokes that accompany any military march help maintain morale while covering the kilometers that separate the army from its ultimate objectives. Yet, experienced, non-commissioned officers quietly voice concerns about certain troubling indicators that suggest all may not be proceeding according to plan. Supply wagons that should be accompanying the combat units are nowhere to be seen, creating uncertainty about how long the troops can maintain their current pace of advance. Cavalry reconnaissance reports remain fragmentary and contradictory, providing insufficient information about enemy dispositions and intentions. Most worryingly, the coordination between different wings of the army appears less precise than the strategic situation demands, with communication delays and command confusion that could prove catastrophic if circumstances require rapid tactical adjustments. The afternoon brings the first serious contact with enemy forces near the crossroads village of Cotter-Brass. Dutch and Belgian troops occupied defensive positions among the farm buildings and hedgerows that dominate this strategic intersection, supported by artillery that commands the approaches from multiple directions. The position is not particularly strong by the standards of field fortification, but it's held by troops fighting on familiar ground with the advantage of prepared positions and coordinated fires. Marshal Ney's initial assault proceeds with the mechanical precision that characterizes veteran French units. It quickly becomes apparent that the enemy is present in greater strength than intelligence reports had suggested. British reinforcements arrive throughout the afternoon, fed into the battle as fast as they can march up from their scattered cantonments. The fighting that develops around the crossroads proves fiercer and more sustained than anyone had anticipated, with casualties mounting steadily on both sides as attack follows counterattack in an escalating cycle of violence. Your own baptism of fire in this campaign comes during the afternoon assault on a farm complex that anchors the Allied left flank. The approach requires advancing across open ground swept by musket fire from buildings whose thick stone walls provide excellent protection for the defenders. The familiar drill of loading and firing becomes more difficult under combat conditions, with smoke obscuring targets and the constant zip and crack of enemy bullets creating a level of stress that makes fine motor control challenging even for experienced soldiers. The reality of combat, despite your years of experience, still possesses the power to shock and disorient. Men you've marched with for years fall around you with cries that seem to come from another world. Their bodies twisted into positions that speak eloquently of the violence that created them. The smell of gunpowder mixes with less pleasant odors as wounds are opened and lives ended with the mechanical efficiency of industrial edge warfare. Your own survival depends on instincts developed over years of similar experiences, but survival feels more like luck than skill when musket balls pass close enough to part your hair. The assault succeeds eventually, but at a cost that makes victory feel hollow and temporary. The farm buildings are secured, the enemy driven back, but your regiment has suffered casualties that it can ill afford and gained ground that may prove impossible to hold if circumstances turn against French interests. The wounded cry for help in voices that carry clearly across the battlefield, while the dead lie silent in positions that mark the high water mark of their final charge. The evening brings a tactical stalemate that satisfies neither side's strategic objectives. French forces hold Cotter-Brass, but Wellington's army remains intact and in position to either retreat toward Brussels or advance to support the Prussians as circumstances dictate. The Prussians themselves have fought a separate battle at Ligny, where Napoleon achieved a tactical victory but failed to destroy Blucher's army as completely as strategic success required. The day's fighting has been costly for both sides without producing the decisive assaults that might justify the expenditure of so many lives. As darkness falls and the soldiers settle into whatever shelter they can improvise, the conversations around campfires reveal a mixture of satisfaction and concern that reflects the complex realities of the tactical situation. The army has demonstrated its continued effectiveness as a fighting force, but the enemy has proven more resilient and better coordinated than optimistic projections had suggested. Tomorrow will bring new challenges that may determine whether Napoleon's gamble will achieve the dramatic success that France desperately needs, or end in the kind of catastrophic defeat that could seal the empire's fate permanently. The night passes uneasily, with both sides using the darkness to reorganize their forces and prepare for the renewed fighting that dawn will certainly bring. Intelligence reports suggest that Wellington is withdrawing toward Brussels, potentially offering Napoleon the opportunity to defeat the Allied armies separately before they can unite their forces. But the Prussians remain a factor in the strategic equation, and their intentions remain unclear despite the tactical defeat they suffered at Ligny. The mathematics of warfare suggests that time favors the Allies, who can afford to trade space for time while awaiting the arrival of additional reinforcements that will eventually make their victory inevitable. Dawn breaks gray and cheerless over the Belgian countryside on June 18, 1815, with heavy clouds promising rain and a mist that clings to the valleys like the breath of ghosts. You wake from fitful sleep on ground still damp from the previous night's downpour, your uniform stiff with dried mud and your musket requiring careful attention to ensure the powder hasn't been compromised by moisture. Around you, 70,000 French soldiers perform the same morning rituals, checking their equipment and consuming what may be their final meal as the army prepares for what everyone understands will be the decisive battle of the campaign. The ridge of Mont Saint-Jean stretches across the landscape like a natural fortress, its gentle slopes crowned with a thin red line of Wellington's Anglo army. Through your field glass, you can make out the distinctive uniforms that mark British infantry squares, the colorful jackets of various German contingents, and the blue coats of Dutch and Belgian troops, who have taken their places in what appears to be a carefully prepared defensive position. The enemy has chosen their ground well, occupying the reverse slope of the ridge where they can shelter from artillery fire, while maintaining clear fields of fire across the approaches that any attacking force must traverse. The farmhouse of Hougoumont sits like a medieval castle on Wellington's right flank, its thick stone walls and surrounding gardens transformed into a fortress that commands the southern approaches to the Allied position. Further east, the farm of La Haye-Sainte occupies similarly commanding ground in the center of the battlefield, while the villages of Papelotte and La Haye complete the chain of strongpoints that anchor Wellington's defensive line. These seemingly humble agricultural buildings have been transformed overnight into military obstacles that will channel French attacks into predetermined killing zones where Allied firepower can be concentrated with devastating effect. Napoleon himself appears among the troops as the morning progresses, mounted on his familiar white horse and surrounded by the glittering staff officers. His uniforms seem to capture what little sunlight penetrates the overcast sky. His presence generates the familiar electric excitement that has followed him across Europe for 2 decades, with soldiers cheering and raising their shackles on the points of their bayonets in the traditional gesture of military enthusiasm. But veteran eyes note subtle changes in the emperor's appearance and demeanor. He moves more slowly than in previous campaigns, seems less decisive in his gestures, and displays the kind of physical discomfort that suggests his legendary energy may finally be showing signs of human limitation. The artillery bombardment that opens the battle creates a thunder that can be heard for miles in every direction, as 80 French guns concentrate their fire on Wellington's Ridge in an attempt to soften the Allied defenses before the infantry assault begins. The sound is overwhelming, a continuous roar that makes communication nearly impossible and turns the air itself into a physical presence that presses against your chest with each explosion. Smoke billows across the battlefield in great gray clouds that obscure vision and create an otherworldly landscape where familiar landmarks disappear and reappear like islands in a turbulent sea. But the bombardment Impressive though it appears, achieves less than its architects had hoped. Wellington's infantry, positioned on the reverse slope of the ridge, suffers relatively light casualties from artillery fire that passes over their heads or buries itself harmlessly in the soft earth. The British commander's defensive tactics, developed through years of fighting in the peninsula, proved perfectly adapted to the tactical realities of Napoleonic warfare. His troops remained largely invisible to French observers, protected by terrain and positioned to deliver devastating volleys when attacking columns finally come within effective musket range. The first major assault begins around 1:30 in the afternoon, as Durlin-S, the First Corps, advances across the valley in massive column formations that represent the concentrated power of nearly 20,000 French infantry. You march in the second wave, part of a human tide that flows across the muddy ground, toward the thin red line that marks Wellington's main position. The approach requires crossing roughly 800 yards of open ground under increasingly intense fire from enemy artillery, light infantry, and finally the main battle line itself. The experience of advancing under fire tests every lesson learned during years of military service, demanding the kind of steady nerve that can only come from repeated exposure to mortal danger. Artillery rounds create great fountains of mud and debris as they strike the saturated ground, while shot-tin canisters filled with musket ball sterns tire sections of the advancing column into bloody chaos when fired at close range. Men fall around you with cries that seem to come from another world, their bodies twisted into positions that speak eloquently of the violence that has claimed them. Your own survival depends on maintaining the mechanical rhythm of advance despite every instinct that screams for you to seek shelter or flee from the storm of lead and iron that fills the air. The column moves forward with the inexorable momentum of a natural force. Individual will subsumed into collective purpose as thousands of men advance toward an objective that many of them will never reach. The mud clings to your boots with every step, making movement difficult and exhausting, while the weight of your equipment grows heavier with each yard covered under fire. The final approach to Wellington's line reveals the true genius of his defensive preparations. The Allied infantry, invisible during the long advance across the valley, suddenly appears along the crest of the ridge as if materialized from thin air. Thousands of muskets point toward the approaching French columns, their bronze barrels glinting dully in the gray light as sergeants call out range estimates and officers prepare to give the order that will unleash controlled volleys of devastating firepower. The British volleys, when they come, strike the French columns with the force of a natural disaster. Entire ranks disappear in clouds of smoke and screams. Its disciplined firepower demonstrates superiority over individual courage in tactical formations designed for a different kind of warfare. The mathematical precision of the killing is almost beautiful in its efficiency. Allied battalion fires in sequence, creating a continuous storm of lead that no attacking force can sustain indefinitely without overwhelming numerical superiority or tactical advantages that the French simply do not possess. Your own column staggers under the impact of successive volleys, men dropping by the dozens as British firepower strips away the leading ranks with mechanical precision. The momentum that carried you across the valley dissipates rapidly under such punishment, and the advance slows, stops, spasms, and finally begins to waver as even veteran soldiers reach the limits of their endurance. The order to withdraw, when it finally comes, feels like salvation rather than defeat, and a retreat across the blood-soaked ground becomes a race against the continued fire that follows the withdrawing French forces. The failure of the first great assault creates a lull in the fighting that allows both sides to reorganize their forces and assess the tactical situation. French casualties have been severe, with several regiments reduced to half their original strength, but the army remains intact and capable of renewed offensive action. Wellington's forces have suffered lighter losses, but are now fully committed to their defensive positions. With little flexibility, for tactical maneuver if circumstances require rapid response to changing conditions. Napoleon's response to the tactical setback reveals both his continued strategic brilliance and the constraints under which he must operate. Rather than repeat the frontal assault that has already proven costly and ineffective, he orders a massive cavalry charge designed to exploit what appears to be weakness in Wellington's center. Marshal Ney leads nearly 5,000 horsemen, cuirassiers, lancers, chasseurs, and carabineers in a magnificent display of military pageantry that represents the concentrated striking power of the imperial cavalry. The sight of 5,000 mounted men advancing across the battlefield in perfect formation creates one of the most spectacular military displays in European history. The cuirassiers, armored in steel breastplates that gleam despite the overcast sky, ride in the front ranks on horses trained to maintain perfect alignment despite the chaos and noise of battle. Behind them come the lancers with their 9-foot weapons, followed by lighter cavalry whose sabers catch what little light penetrates the smoke that hangs over the battlefield like a funeral shroud. But spectacle and tactical effectiveness prove to be different things entirely when the cavalry encounters Wellington's prepared defenses. The British infantry, formed in squares that present a hedge of bayonets in every direction, prove impervious to mounted attack, despite the magnificent courage displayed by the French horsemen. Cavalry cannot break properly formed infantry squares unless supported by artillery or infantry attacks that force the defenders to adopt formations vulnerable to mounted assault. Napoleon's cavalry charges, unsupported by adequate infantry or artillery, accomplish nothing except the systematic destruction of some of the finest horsemen in Europe. The failure of the cavalry attacks leaves Napoleon with increasingly limited options for achieving the decisive victory that strategic circumstances demand. Time favors Wellington, who can expect Prussian reinforcements to arrive before nightfall, while every hour of delay reduces French chances of success, even if tactical. Victories can be achieved against the immediate opposition. The emperor's tactical genius, undimmed by age or circumstances, must now work with inadequate tools to accomplish objectives that may have become impossible given the balance of forces and the tactical situation. The attack on La Haye-Sainte farmhouse represents Napoleon's final attempt to break Wellington's center before Prussian intervention makes victory impossible. The King's German Legion troops defending the farm fight with desperate courage, knowing that the fall of their position will create a gap in the Allied line that French reserves can exploit to achieve decisive breakthrough. The fighting around the farm buildings proves as vicious as any combat in the entire Napoleonic period, with men dying room by room in struggles that pit bayonet against bayonet in contests where individual skill and desperate courage determine outcomes. Your role in the assault on La Haye-Sainte brings you face to face with the most intimate realities of Napoleonic warfare. The approach to the farm requires advancing across open ground, swept by fire from multiple directions, while the assault itself involves close quarters fighting in buildings and courtyards, where muskets become clubs and bayonets become the primary weapons. The smoke inside the buildings creates a choking fog that makes identification of friend and foe nearly impossible, while the confined spaces amplify every sound until the noise becomes physically painful. The farm falls eventually, but at a cost that makes victory feel like defeat. Your regiment, which began the day with nearly 800 men, now counts fewer than 400 effective soldiers. The casualties include many of the veteran sergeants and corporals whose experience and leadership held the unit together during previous crises, leaving gaps in the chain of command that will be difficult to fill with the inexperienced survivors. The tactical success of capturing La Haye-Sainte creates opportunities for exploitation, but the French army lacks the fresh reserves necessary to transform tactical advantage into strategic victory. The appearance of Prussian forces on Napoleon's right flank around 4:30 in the afternoon changes the entire character of the battle and seals the emperor's fate with mathematical certainty. Blucher S., the Fourth Corps, advancing from Waver despite their defeat at Ligny 2 days earlier, represents fresh troops whose intervention tips the numerical balance decisively in favor of the Allied coalition. The sight of Prussian uniforms on the skyline sends a visible shudder through French ranks, as even the most optimistic soldiers recognize that their strategic situation has become hopeless. The final act of the drama begins with the advance of the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's last reserve in the elite formation that has never known defeat in 20 years of European warfare. 8 battalions of the Guard, roughly 4,000 men who represent the cream of the French army, advance across the same bloody ground where so many previous attacks have been shattered against Wellington's defensive line. The sight of the Guard advancing generates wild enthusiasm among the exhausted French troops, who believe that their elite comrades can accomplish what ordinary regiments have failed to achieve. But the Guard advances into a tactical situation that has deteriorated beyond the point where even elite troops can achieve decisive results. Wellington's line, weakened by hours of combat, has been reinforced by reserves brought up from positions that were no longer threatened by French attacks. The British artillery, conserved throughout the day for this crucial moment, concentrates its fire on the advancing Guard with devastating effect. Critically, the Prussian attack on the French right flank has forced Napoleon to divert troops that might otherwise have supported the Guard's assault. The repulse of the Imperial Guard creates a psychological shock that ripples through the entire French army with the speed of lightning. These men, who have never been defeated, who represent the concentrated martial virtue of Napoleon's empire, retreat in disorder from Wellington's Ridge with casualties that speak eloquently of the violence they have encountered. The cry of La Garde recule spreads through the ranks like wildfire, carrying with it the implication that if the Guard cannot succeed, no French force can hope to achieve victory against such opposition. What follows can only be described as the collapse of one of history's great armies. Units that have maintained their cohesion throughout hours of desperate fighting suddenly disintegrate as men decide, individually, that continued resistance serves no purpose except to add their own names to casualty lists that already include too many friends and comrades. The retreat that begins as an organized withdrawal quickly degenerates into a rout as panic spreads, cued through formations that no longer possess the leadership or morale necessary to maintain military discipline under extreme stress. Two centuries after the cannons fell silent across the fields of Waterloo, the earth itself begins to speak of that terrible day in ways that written records never could. The year is 2015, and construction crews working on a new parking lot for the Waterloo Battlefield Museum make a discovery that will transform our understanding of how the dead of Napoleon's final battle were treated in the immediate aftermath of that decisive engagement. Their mechanical excavators, intended merely to level the ground for modern convenience, instead uncover what archaeologists will later describe as one of the most significant mass graves from the Napoleonic period ever found in Western Europe. The discovery occurs on a gray March morning that seems to echo the weather conditions that prevailed during the battle itself. The construction foreman, a practical man named Francois de Moret, who has lived in the area his entire life, initially assumes that the dark stain in the earth revealed by his excavators represents nothing more than an old refuse pit or foundation, remains from some long demolished farm building. The soil around Waterloo is rich with the debris of human habitation stretching back centuries, and construction projects routinely uncover pottery fragments, old tools, hay, and the stone foundations of buildings that disappeared from memory generations ago. But this stain proves different in ways that become apparent as soon as the excavation proceeds beyond the initial surface layer. The soil is unusually dark and rich, with an organic content that suggests decomposition on a massive scale. more tellingly. The first shovelful of earth reveals fragments of metal that gleam dully despite their aged brass buttons, iron buckles, and pieces of military equipment that speak of violent death rather than peaceful abandonment. Within hours of the initial discovery, local authorities halt the construction work and contact the Belgian Archaeological Service to investigate. What clearly represents a significant historical find, Dr. Dominique Bosquet, the senior archaeologist assigned to lead the investigation, arrives at the site with the measured excitement that characterizes professionals who have spent their careers hoping for exactly this kind of discovery. The initial survey work reveals a rectangular depression roughly 30 meters long and 15 meters wide, filled with soil that shows clear evidence of rapid burial and subsequent centuries of slow decomposition. The careful mapping and photographing that precede actual excavation suggests that this grave contains the remains of perhaps 200 individuals, hastily interred in the days immediately following the battle. The excavation itself proceeds with the painstaking care that modern archaeology demands, each layer of soil carefully removed and sifted for artifacts that might provide information about the identity and circumstances of those buried here. The work requires weeks of patient labor, as volunteers and graduate students work with brushes and dental tools to expose skeletal remains that have lain undisturbed since 1815. The bones emerge from the earth like pieces of a vast puzzle, each one photographed, measured, and cataloged before removal to laboratory facilities where detailed analysis can begin. The first complete skeleton to be exposed tells a story that will be repeated dozens of times throughout the excavation. The remains belong to a young man, probably in his early 20s, whose bones show clear evidence of the violence that claimed his life 2 centuries ago. A musket ball remains lodged in his ribcage, while cut marks on his skull suggest wounds inflicted by a cavalry saber during the final moments of his life. His uniform buttons, preserved by the peculiar chemistry of the burial environment, identify him as a member of a French line regiment, though his name and specific unit remain matters for speculation rather than certainty. But it's the position of the skeleton that proves most revealing about the circumstances of his burial. He lies twisted and contorted, arms askew and legs bent at unnatural angles, in a position that could only result from being thrown hastily into a mass grave by men working under extreme time pressure. There are no signs of the careful preparation that would characterize normal civilian burial practices, no evidence that the body was straightened, positioned with dignity, or accompanied by personal possessions that might ease the transition to whatever comes after death. This man was simply disposed of, like refuse that needed to be cleared away before it could pose a threat to public health. The artifacts recovered from the grave provide a fascinating catalog of military life in the early 19th century, preserved by the anaerobic conditions that prevented complete decomposition. Uniform buttons bearing the eagles and regimental numbers of units from across Napoleon's empire tell the story of how men from every corner of Europe came to die together in a Belgian field. French infantry buttons mingle with those from guard units, while cavalry equipment suggests that mounted soldiers were buried alongside, or dismounted comrades, without regard for the distinctions of rank and service that had defined their military lives. Personal possessions scattered throughout the grave speak of individual lives cut short by the impersonal violence of industrial-age warfare. Coins from half a dozen countries suggest the diverse origins of soldiers who served in Napoleon's cosmopolitan army, while religious medallions and carved bone dice hint at the hopes and diversions that helped men endure the hardships of campaign life. A comb made from cattle horn, carefully carved with decorative patterns, represents someone's effort to maintain personal dignity despite the brutal conditions of military service. These objects, mundane in themselves, become poignant when considered as the final possessions of men whose names are lost to history, but whose bones now testify to their final moments. The forensic analysis conducted on the skeletal remains reveals details about the battle and its aftermath that no written account could provide. The pattern of wounds suggests that many of these men die not from the relatively clean deaths inflicted by musket balls, but from the brutal trauma associated with artillery fire, cavalry charges, and hand-to-hand combat with edged weapons. Shattered skulls speak of saber cuts and pistol shots delivered at point-blank range, while bones bearing multiple fractures tell of men who were trampled by horses or crushed beneath artillery wheels during the chaotic final hours of the engagement. Perhaps most significantly, the forensic evidence suggests that some of these men may have survived their initial wounds only to die later from blood loss, infection, or exposure during the confusion that followed the battle. Bone healing patterns indicate that several individuals had suffered previous injuries that were in various stages of recovery, suggesting that wounded veterans from earlier engagements had been pressed back into service for Napoleon's final campaign. The discovery provides sobering evidence of how the imperial war machine consumed human lives with an efficiency that left little room for adequate medical care or proper convalescence. The laboratory work that follows the initial excavation reveals layers of information about the Battle of Waterloo and its aftermath that transform our understanding of both the immediate event and the broader context of Napoleonic warfare. Dr. Sophie Warmenball, the forensic anthropologist leading the scientific analysis, approaches each skeleton as both a historical document and a human individual whose story deserves to be told with accuracy and respect. Her work combines traditional archaeological methods with cutting-edge techniques borrowed from forensic science, creating a detailed picture of how these men lived, fought, and died during one of history's most famous battles. The demographic analysis of the skeletal remains provides stark evidence of the human cost exacted by Napoleon's military ambitions. The average age of death proves to be remarkably young, barely 22 years old, with some individuals showing evidence of adolescent bone development that suggests they were pressed into service before reaching full physical maturity. This finding aligns with historical records indicating that France's military recruitment had become increasingly desperate by 1815, conscripting boys who would have been considered too young for military service during the earlier, more successful phases of the Napoleonic Wars. Height measurements derived from the long bones paint a disturbing picture of nutritional deprivation that affected entire generations of European men during this period. The average height of the Waterloo dead falls significantly below modern norms, with many individuals showing evidence of childhood malnutrition that stunted their growth and left permanent markers in their skeletal development. The tallest individuals in the grave barely reach what would be considered average height today, while several skeletons suggest men who stood no more than 5 feet tall in life. Physical dimensions that speak eloquently of the harsh economic conditions that prevailed across much of Europe during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. The pattern of injuries recorded on the bones provides unprecedented insight into the nature of combat during the battle itself, revealing details that eyewitness accounts and official reports never captured. Musket ball impacts show that most men died from wounds inflicted at relatively close range, supporting historical accounts that describe the fighting as particularly intense and personal. The trajectory angles of projectiles lodged in bones suggest that much of the killing occurred during close-quarters combat rather than long-range exchanges of volley fire, indicating that the battle devolved into the kind of intimate violence that characterizes the final phases of major engagements, saber and bayonet. Wounds tell an even more disturbing story about the final moments of these soldiers' lives. The forensic evidence indicates that many men suffered multiple wounds, suggesting that they continued fighting even after receiving injuries that would have been incapacitating under normal circumstances. The adrenaline and desperation of combat appears to have enabled wounded soldiers to remain effective until blood loss or shock finally claimed them. A phenomenon well documented in modern warfare, but rarely described with such clinical precision. For historical battles, the presence of defensive wounds, injuries to forearms and hands that result from attempting to ward off attacks, provides evidence of the desperate hand-to-hand fighting that characterized the battle's climactic phases. These wounds, clearly visible on several skeletons, indicate that men fought for their lives with whatever weapons they could improvise when their primary equipment was lost or damaged. Some bones show evidence of injuries inflicted by improvised weapons, suggesting that soldiers used rocks, broken equipment, or even their bare hands in final struggles that determined whether they lived or died. Perhaps most significantly, the forensic analysis reveals evidence that contradicts the traditional narrative of rapid death and immediate burial that has characterized most historical accounts of the battle's aftermath. Several skeletons show clear signs of infection and bone remodeling that could only have occurred if the individuals survived their initial wounds for days or weeks before finally succumbing to their injuries. This finding suggests that the immediate post-battle period involved considerably more human suffering than previously understood. With wounded soldiers lingering in agony while overwhelmed medical services struggled to provide adequate care. As the months of analysis progress, the individual skeletons begin to reveal personal stories that transform abstract historical events into human narratives of remarkable poignancy and power. Each set of remains represents not just a casualty statistic, but a young man who left his family, traveled hundreds of miles from home, died violently in a foreign field for causes that may have meant little to him personally. Dr. Warmanbaugh and her team developed informal names for some of the more complete skeletons, partly to facilitate laboratory organization, but also to acknowledge the human individuality that scientific analysis can sometimes obscure. Henry, as the researchers call Skeleton 23, emerges as one of the most complete and informative remains in the entire collection. His bones indicate a man who stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall and died at approximately age 19, with dental development suggesting he had not yet reached full physical maturity when he was killed. The cause of death appears to have been a cavalry saber blow that struck him just above the left ear, severing crucial blood vessels and probably causing near instantaneous unconsciousness. His uniform buttons identify him as a member of the 8th Regiment of Line Infantry, a unit that historical records indicate was formed in the Alsace region of eastern France. But Henry's story extends far beyond the moment of his death, as evidenced by the detailed history written in his bones. Healed fractures in his left arm suggest an injury sustained months or years before Waterloo, probably during training or an earlier campaign. The pattern of bone remodeling indicates that he received adequate medical care for this injury, possibly during a period of garrison duty when military physicians had time to provide proper treatment. His teeth show evidence of significantly better nutrition during childhood than many of his comrades, suggesting he came from a family with adequate resources to provide proper food during crucial developmental years. Most poignantly, Henry's personal possessions include a small silver cross that was worn on a chain around his neck, its surface polished smooth by years of handling. The religious symbolism suggests a young man who found comfort in faith during the hardships of military service, while the wear patterns indicate that he touched it frequently, perhaps during moments of stress or uncertainty. The cross bears no inscription or identifying marks, but its presence in the grave provides intimate evidence of personal beliefs that official records never captured and that died with its owner on a Belgian battlefield. Gustav, designated as Skeleton 47, tells a different but equally compelling story about the diverse origins and experiences of Napoleon's soldiers. His isotope signature indicates childhood spent in what is now Eastern Germany, while his height nearly 6 feet tall marks him as exceptionally large for his era and suggests better than average nutrition during his formative years. The cause of death appears to have been a musket ball that struck him in the chest, penetrating the heart and causing immediate death. His uniform buttons identified him as a member of one of the foreign regiments that served in Napoleon's armies, units composed of men from territories conquered during the earlier phases of the French expansion. Gustave's bones tell a story of harsh military service that took a severe toll on his physical condition, despite his initial advantages of size. In nutrition, evidence of chronic malnutrition during his final months indicates that he experienced the same dietary deprivations that affected all soldiers during the 1815 campaign, while stress markers on his skeleton suggest periods of intense physical activity that pushed his body beyond normal limits of endurance. Most tellingly, his teeth show evidence of deliberate filing or modification that may have been performed to improve the fit of military equipment, a practice occasionally documented among soldiers who sought to adapt their bodies to the demands of military service. The weapons and equipment associated with Gustave provide additional insights into the practical realities of Napoleonic military service. His musket, though badly corroded after 2 centuries in the ground, shows evidence of field modifications that improved its reliability under combat conditions. The lock mechanism has been carefully adjusted, probably by a regimental armorer, while the wooden stock bears carved initials that may represent his name or the names of comrades who shared the weapon. These modifications, performed with considerable skill and attention to detail, indicate that soldiers took personal responsibility for maintaining their equipment in conditions where institutional support was often inadequate. Antoine, known to the researchers as Skeleton 12, represents perhaps the most tragic case among the Waterloo dead. His bones indicate that he was probably no more than 16 years old when he died, with the epiphyseal fusion pattern suggesting that his growth plates had not yet closed completely. The cause of death appears to have been multiple wounds inflicted during close combat, including a bayonet thrust that penetrated his abdomen and saber cuts that fractured several ribs. The pattern of injuries suggests that he fought desperately for his life, sustaining defensive wounds that indicate he remained conscious and combative even after receiving mortal injuries. Antoine's skeleton shows clear evidence of the childhood malnutrition that affected much of Europe during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. His final height of barely 5 feet reflects stunted growth caused by inadequate food during crucial developmental years, while his teeth display the enamel defects that result from severe dietary restrictions during tooth formation. Most heartbreakingly, his bones show evidence that he was still growing at the time of his death, with new bone formation patterns indicating that his body was continuing its attempt to reach full adult size even as military service subjected him to stresses that his immature psyche could barely endure. The personal possessions found with Antoine include a small wooden whistle, carefully carved and showing signs of frequent use. The instrument suggests a young man who found solace in music during the hardships of campaign life, while its craftsmanship indicates either personal skill or a gift from someone who cared about his well-being. Military records from the period indicate that music played an important role in maintaining morale among troops, with informal performances around campfires providing entertainment and emotional release during difficult times. Antoine's whistle represents his personal participation in this musical tradition, a creative outlet that provided brief respites from the grinding realities of military service. The collective analysis of all the skeletal remains reveals patterns that illuminate the broader social and economic conditions that prevailed across Europe during the Napoleonic period. The universal evidence of childhood malnutrition indicates that poor nutrition was not limited to specific regions or social classes, but represented a continental crisis that affected entire generations. The demographic concentration of very Young soldiers suggest that normal recruitment patterns had broken down by 1815, forcing military authorities to conscript boys who would have been considered unsuitable for service during more prosperous periods. The Atlantic wind carries salt spray across the jagged cliffs of St. Helena as the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon on the evening of May 4th, 1821. The remote island, positioned like a forgotten period mark in the vast expanse of the South Atlantic, has served as Napoleon Bonaparte's final prison for nearly 6 years. Tonight, as every night for the past 2,000 days, the man who once commanded the loyalty of millions and reshaped the political geography of Europe will take his evening meal in the modest dining room of Longwood House, surrounded by the handful of faithful companions who chose to share his exile rather than abandon him to solitude and obscurity. The island itself seems designed by nature to serve as a prison for fallen greatness. St. Helena rises from the ocean like a volcanic fortress, its sheer cliffs and treacherous currents making escape virtually impossible even for those with maritime skills and adequate vessels. The interior landscape, though possessing its own stark beauty, offers little to comfort a man accustomed to the palaces of Europe and the adulation of crowds. Rolling hills, covered in sparse vegetation, stretch toward distant peaks, shrouded in perpetual mist, while the few roads traverse terrain that seems deliberately calculated to remind the inhabitants of their isolation from the civilized world. Longwood House, Napoleon's final residence, reflects the deliberate humiliation that his captors intended rather than any genuine attempt to provide comfortable accommodations for a former head of state. The building, originally constructed as a barn and hastily converted to serve as lodgings for the imperial exile, consists of barely a dozen rooms that would be considered cramped quarters for a moderately prosperous merchant family. The walls are thin, the ceilings low, and the windows small, creating an atmosphere of confinement that serves as a constant reminder of how far the emperor has fallen from his former grandeur. The man who prepares for dinner this evening bears little resemblance to the dynamic leader who once inspired armies to follow him across half the world. Napoleon at 51 shows the accumulated toll of decades spent in pursuit of impossible dreams and the grinding stress of 6 years spent contemplating the wreckage of his ambitions. His famous energy has given way to a lethargic depression that makes even simple daily activities require conscious effort. The compact muscular frame that once radiated physical authority has grown soft and heavy, while his skin has taken on the pallor that comes from limited exercise and chronic illness. Yet, traces of the old magnetism remain visible to those who know how to look. The gray eyes that once commanded the attention of kings and generals still possess moments of startling intensity when some topic captures his interest or provokes his indignation. The hands that signed treaties and directed battles retain their expressiveness, gesturing with unconscious authority even when discussing trivial domestic matters. Most remarkably, the voice that once addressed the masses retains much of its compelling quality, capable of transforming casual conversation into something approaching oratory when the speaker forgets his circumstances and remembers his former greatness. The daily routine at Longwood House has evolved over the years of exile into a carefully structured ritual that provides some semblance of purpose and dignity to lives that might otherwise dissolve into purposeless tedium. The morning hours are devoted to correspondence, as Napoleon maintains an extensive letter-writing campaign with supporters, family members, and sympathizers across Europe who keep him informed about political developments and provide connections to a world that increasingly regards him as a figure from the past rather than a continuing influence on contemporary events. The afternoons typically bring sessions of dictation, as Napoleon works methodically through his memoirs with the assistance of Emmanuel Lost Cases, Charles Maitland, and other companions who serve as secretaries, editors, collaborative partners in the massive project of constructing a version of recent history that portrays the emperor's actions in the most favorable possible light. These sessions often extend for hours, with Napoleon pacing restlessly around the small rooms while reconstructing battles, analyzing political decisions, and defending choices that led ultimately to his current circumstances. But it is the evening meal that provides the most significant punctuation mark for each day, representing both the continuation of the ceremonial traditions that once surrounded the emperor and a poignant reminder of how reduced his circumstances have become. The dining room at Longwood House, barely large enough to accommodate 6 people comfortably, serves as the stage for a nightly performance that maintains the illusion of imperial dignity. Despite surroundings that would be considered modest by middle-class standards, tonight's dinner companions represent the core of Napoleon's remaining household, each one bound to him by ties of loyalty, affection, or simply the absence of attractive alternatives to life in exile. Charles Tristan de Montaigne, former general whose political connections were permanently compromised by his association with the fallen regime, serves as the senior member of Napoleon's court in exile and assumes many of the ceremonial functions that would have belonged to major palace officials during the glory days of the empire. His wife, Albine de Montaigne, provides the only female presence in the household and attempts to maintain some semblance of social refinement. Despite the constraints imposed by their island prison, Francesco Antimarchi, the Corsican physician who arrived on the island 3 years earlier to serve as Napoleon's personal doctor, brings professional expertise in Mediterranean sensibilities that sometimes clash with the formal protocols preferred by the French members of the household. Medical assessments of Napoleon's declining health provide an unwelcome but necessary reminder that the emperor's time may be more limited than any of them care to acknowledge. Yet his presence also offers hope that proper medical care might arrest or reverse the physical deterioration that has become increasingly apparent over recent months. Louis Marchand, Napoleon's valet, and probably the person who knows him most intimately, occupies a unique position that combines personal service with genuine affection. His daily responsibilities include everything from managing Napoleon's wardrobe to supervising meal preparation. But his real value lies in providing the kind of unquestioning loyalty and practical competence that allows the household to function, despite the numerous challenges posed by isolation, limited resources, and the gradual decline of its central figure. The clock in the hallway chimes 7 as Napoleon takes his customary place at the head of the modest dining table. His movements slower and more deliberate than they were even a month ago. The progressive deterioration in his health has become impossible to ignore. Despite his own attempts to maintain the routines and appearances that have sustained him through nearly 6 years of exile, his breathing has grown labored during even minimal exertion, while his appetite has dwindled to the point where completing a normal meal requires conscious effort rather than the natural pleasure he once took in good food and convivial company. Dr. Antimarchi, seated to Napoleon's right in recognition of both his professional status and his growing importance as the household's primary link to the outside world, observes his patient with the careful attention that has characterized their relationship since his arrival on the island. Its physician's Mediterranean training, though different from the medical practices favored in Northern Europe, has provided him with extensive experience in treating chronic ailments that resist conventional remedies. Yet his increasing concern about Napoleon's condition is evident in the worried glances he exchanges with other household members and the carefully neutral expression he maintains when discussing his patient's prospects for recovery. The evening's first course consists of a simple soup prepared from vegetables grown in Longwood's kitchen garden, seasoned with herbs that have been carefully cultivated to provide some variety in the limited diet available on an island whose agricultural resources cannot support elaborate cuisine. Napoleon takes a few spoonfuls with evident effort. His once hearty appetite reduced to the mechanical consumption of nutrients necessary to sustain basic physiological functions. The soup, though adequately prepared, seems to provide little pleasure or satisfaction to a man who once enjoyed the elaborate banquets that celebrated military victories and diplomatic triumphs. The conversation that accompanies the meal flows with the practiced ease of people who have shared similar evenings for thousands of consecutive days. Yet tonight carries undertones of melancholy and finality that seem to acknowledge changes that none of them cared to discuss explicitly. Monthlon mentions news from recent visitors about political developments in France, where the Bourbon Restoration continues to struggle with problems of legitimacy and popular support that were never fully resolved after Napoleon's final defeat. The reports suggest growing dissatisfaction with the conservative policies that followed the excitement and energy of the revolutionary and imperial periods. The French people, Napoleon observes with a trace of his former authority, will eventually recognize that we offered them glory, while our successors can promise only the mediocrity of restored aristocracy and foreign influence. His voice carries conviction despite his physical weakness, and for a moment the declining invalid disappears, placed by the political visionary, who once inspired millions to believe that human society could be reorganized according to rational principles rather than inherited tradition. The transformation is brief but striking, reminding his companions of the intellectual power that made him one of history's most influential figures. The main course arrives with the quiet efficiency that characterizes all service at Longwood House, consisting of roasted fowl prepared with considerable skill, despite the limitations imposed by available ingredients and cooking facilities. Napoleon makes a valiant effort to do justice to the meal, cutting small pieces and chewing them slowly while maintaining his participation in the evening's conversation. His companions, long practiced in the delicate art of appearing not to notice his growing physical limitations, continue their discussion while surreptitiously monitoring his condition and adjusting their expectations accordingly. The wine served with dinner comes from bottles that represent some of the last remnants of Napoleon's former cellars, saved during the chaos that followed Waterloo and transported to St. Helena through the efforts of loyal servants who understood their emotional as well as monetary value. The vintage, though excellent by any objective standard, seemed to provide little of the satisfaction that good wine once brought to a man who appreciated the finer aspects of civilized living. Tonight, as most evenings recently, Napoleon barely touches his glass, whether from loss of appetite, medical caution, or simple indifference to pleasures that no longer seem relevant to his circumstances. The topics of conversation shift gradually from current political affairs to historical analysis, as Napoleon begins one of his characteristic examinations of military campaigns from previous eras. His intellectual engagement with strategic and tactical questions remains unimpaired despite his physical decline, and his analysis of ancient battles displays the same penetrating insight, key that made him one of history's greatest military minds. He dissects Caesar's Gallic campaigns with the expertise of a professional soldier, and the perspective of someone who faced similar challenges in extending imperial control over reluctant populations. The secret of successful conquest, he explains to his companions, lies not merely in winning battles, but in creating institutions that outlast military victories. Caesar understood this principle, as did Alexander before him. Temporary success means nothing without permanent transformation of the conquered territories. The observation carries particular poignancy when made by someone whose own conquests proved ephemeral despite initial brilliance, and his listeners recognize the implicit self-criticism embedded in what sounds like objective historical analysis. The dessert course brings fresh fruit obtained through the household's careful relationships with local suppliers, supplemented by simple pastries prepared in Longwood's modest kitchen. Napoleon shows slightly more interest in these lighter foods, though his consumption remains minimal. compared to the hearty appetite he displayed during his years of active campaigning. The fruit, though tropical and unfamiliar from his European perspective, provides some variation in a diet that has necessarily become limited by both health concerns and practical constraints imposed by island living. Marcham, ever attentive to his master's needs and preferences, quietly adjusts the lighting to compensate for the gathering darkness outside, and ensures that Napoleon's chair is positioned to avoid drafts that might aggravate his increasingly sensitive constitution. The valet's movements demonstrate the kind of intuitive understanding that develops between people who have shared intimate daily contact over many years, and his presence provides Napoleon with the continuity and reliability that have become increasingly important as other aspects of his life have grown uncertain or problematic. The gathering darkness outside Longwood House seems to mirror the approaching conclusion of one of history's most extraordinary lives, as Napoleon Bonaparte spends what will prove to be among his final evenings contemplating a legacy that remains as complex and controversial as the man who created it. The wind that sweeps across St. Helena carries with it the vast loneliness of the South Atlantic, reminding the exiled emperor of his separation from the European civilization that he once dominated and that ultimately rejected his vision of rational progress imposed through military conquest and administrative reform. As his dinner companions retired to their own quarters, Napoleon remains in the modest dining room for nearly an hour, sometimes dozing fitfully in his chair, sometimes gazing through the small windows at the alien landscape that has become his final prison. The isolation that once seemed merely inconvenient has gradually revealed itself as a form of living death, cutting him off not just from political influence, but from the human connections and intellectual stimulation that sustained him through decades of extraordinary achievement and spectacular failure. The silence that envelops Longwood House during these late evening hours seems almost tangible, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the island's rocky coastline and the occasional creak of wooden construction settling in the subtropical climate. For a man who once commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, who held court before audiences that included kings and ambassadors, who made decisions that affected the lives of millions across an entire continent, the solitude represents a punishment more severe than any physical torture his captors might have devised. Yet, in this silence, Napoleon finds opportunities for reflection that his active life never permitted. The memories that surface during these quiet hours range across the entire span of his remarkable career. From the young artillery officer who first distinguished himself at the siege of Toulon, to the emperor who abdicated at Fontainebleau, after watching his dreams dissolve in the face of overwhelming opposition. Each memory carries its burden of triumph or regret, success or failure, achievement or loss, creating a mental landscape as complex and contradictory as the man who inhabits it. The early memories, those from his Corsican childhood and military educations, seem to belong to someone else entirely. So completely has the subsequent fame and notoriety transformed his sense of personal identity. The boy who struggled with French pronunciation and felt like an outsider among his more privileged classmates could never have imagined the heights of power and depths of defeat that awaited him. Yet traces of that original personality remain visible in the man who now sits alone in exile. Particularly the combination of intellectual ambition and emotional insecurity that drove him to attempt achievements that more balanced individuals would have recognized as impossible. The years of rising power and expanding influence provide the richest material for nostalgic contemplation. As Napoleon recalls the intoxicating experience of discovering his own capabilities and watching the world reshape itself in response to his will and vision, the Italian campaigns that first brought him to public attention, the Egyptian expedition that added exotic glamour to his growing reputation, the consular period when he consolidated power while transforming French institutions, these memories retained their capacity to generate satisfaction and pride. Despite the ultimate failure of the larger project they represented. But it is the period of imperial grandeur that provides both the greatest source of satisfaction and the most painful reminder of how far he has fallen from his former estate. The coronation at Notre Dame, when he placed the crown upon his own head in a gesture that symbolized the revolutionary principle of self-made authority, represents perhaps the pinnacle of his personal and political achievement. The ceremony combined theatrical spectacle with genuine political transformation, demonstrating his ability to create new forms of legitimacy that transcended traditional assumptions about the divine right of kings and inherited aristocratic privilege. The great military victories that followed his imperial coronation created a legend that will survive long after the political arrangements they made possible have been forgotten. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, and a dozen other battlefields witnessed tactical innovations and strategic insights that permanently changed the nature of European warfare. Napoleon's ability to coordinate the movements of vast armies, to concentrate superior force at decisive points, and to inspire ordinary soldiers to achieve extraordinary results under impossible conditions established him as one of history's greatest military minds. These achievements cannot be diminished by subsequent defeats or political failures. The administrative and legal reforms that Napoleon implemented across his empire represent perhaps his most lasting contribution to human progress, though they receive less attention than his military exploits and political adventures. The Napoleonic Code established legal principles that influenced jurisprudence throughout the world, while his educational reforms created institutional frameworks that survived long after his political power had been destroyed. The systematic approach to government administration that he pioneered became the foundation for modern bureaucratic states across Europe and beyond. Yet, as he sits in the growing darkness of his final exile, Napoleon cannot escape awareness of the human costs that his ambitions exacted from the peoples of Europe. The casualty lists from his campaigns, if compiled systematically, would document suffering on a scale that few individuals in history have been personally responsible for, creating the millions of soldiers who died in battles, fought for his strategic objectives, the civilian populations that endured occupation and exploitation to sustain his war machine, the families destroyed by decades of continuous warfare all represent charges that history will place against whatever positive achievements his career produced. The question of whether these costs could be justified by corresponding benefits remains central to any honest assessment of his historical significance. Napoleon himself has spent countless hours during his exile attempting to construct arguments that would vindicate his choices and demonstrate that the suffering he caused served larger purposes that made the sacrifices worthwhile. Yet intellectual honesty compels him to acknowledge that many of the benefits he claims to have produced for European civilization might have been achieved through less destructive means if he had possessed greater wisdom or self-restraint. The failure of his ultimately grandiose vision weighs particularly heavily during these moments of solitary reflection. As Napoleon confronts the gap between his original aspirations and the modest achievements that will constitute his actual legacy, he once believed that military conquest could create the political conditions necessary for implementing rational reforms that would transform European society according to Enlightenment principles. The reality proved far more complex, as conquered populations resisted foreign rule regardless of the benefits that conquest might theoretically provide. While the demands of continuous warfare corrupted the very ideals that military success was supposed to advance, the personal costs of his imperial ambitions seemed almost as significant as the public ones when measured against the isolation and declining health that characterized his final years. The marriages that were arranged for political advantage rather than personal compatibility. The family relationships that were sacrificed to dynastic considerations. The friendships that were destroyed by the demands of absolute power. represent prices that seemed acceptable when paid by a man intoxicated with success, but appeared tragically expensive when evaluated by someone facing death in lonely exile. The gradual physical decline that has accelerated noticeably during recent months serves as a constant reminder that even the most extraordinary human achievements must eventually yield to biological limitations that make no exceptions for genius, ambition, or historical significance. The stomach ailments that have plagued him for years have grown progressively worse, while his energy and mental acuity have begun to show the first signs of the deterioration that will ultimately claim his life. Each day brings new evidence that his time is limited and that whatever additional contributions he might make to human knowledge or understanding must be compressed into a steadily shrinking window of opportunity. As we return from these journeys through the shadows of the Napoleonic age, settling back into the warmth and safety of your modern evening, the contrast between then and now becomes almost overwhelming in its completeness. The young conscript whose boots wore thin on muddy roads, the veteran who watched an empire crumble at Waterloo, the bones that speak from Belgian soil, the fallen emperor contemplating his legacy in Atlantic exile, seem impossibly distant from the electric lights, comfortable furniture, and quiet security that surround you now. Consider, for a moment, the simple miracle of your current circumstances. The bed that awaits you is softer than anything those soldiers ever knew, protected by walls more secure than any fortress. In a building heated by systems that would have seemed magical to men who froze in the Russian winter, the food in your kitchen surpasses what Napoleon himself enjoyed during his final years, while medical care that you take for granted could have saved thousands of lives that were lost to diseases and injuries that seemed incurable to centuries ago. The peace that allows you to drift toward sleep without fear of midnight alarms or dawn battles represents an achievement that those generations paid for with their blood and suffering. The freedoms you exercise without conscious thought were purchased through struggles that consumed entire lifetimes and reshaped the political geography of nations. The prosperity that you may sometimes take for granted grew from the ruins of systems that those men died to defend or destroy, depending on which side of history's great divide they found themselves. Yet, their stories, covered from archives and archaeological sites, from memoirs and mass graves, remind us that the past remains alive in ways that extend beyond academic curiosity or romantic nostalgia. The struggles they faced, the choices they made, and the prices they paid continue to influence the world we inhabit, creating the foundations upon which our own lives are built. Their experiences, both triumphant and tragic, offer lessons about human resilience, the costs of ambition, and the fragile nature of the civilizations we create and sometimes destroy in pursuit of abstract ideals. As sleep begins to claim you, carry with you an appreciation for the distance that time has placed between your circumstances and theirs. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that the battles they fought have ended, the empires they served have crumbled into historical footnotes, and the causes that seemed so vital to their lives have been superseded by new challenges and different dreams. Their struggles have become our inheritance, a mixed legacy of inspiration and warning that continues to shape our understanding of what it means to be human in a world where individual lives intersect with forces larger than any one person can fully comprehend or control. The silence that surrounds you now is not the silence of battlefields where the dead wait for burial, but the comfortable quiet of safety earned through centuries of gradual progress toward more humane and rational forms of human organization. Sleep well, knowing that you live in the world they helped to create, both through their achievements and their failures, both through their wisdom and their mistakes. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but they will be your challenges rather than theirs, and you will face them with advantages and opportunities that those long-ago soldiers could never have imagined possible. In the end, their greatest gift to you may be simply the reminder that human life continues, that individuals matter, even when they seem swept away by forces beyond their control, and that every generation faces the fundamental challenge of creating meaning and finding purpose within the brief span of years that biology allows us. They lived, fought, suffered, and died so that you could live differently and perhaps better than they were able to do. Rest now in gratitude for their sacrifice and in appreciation of the precious, fragile, an extraordinary gift of peaceful sleep in a world that has learned, however imperfectly, to value human life over abstract political ambitions.